The records sat in the basement of the Chatham County Courthouse for 113 years before anyone thought to examine them closely. Tax assessments, birth registries, property transfers, the ordinary paperwork of a society built on human bondage. But buried in those yellowing ledgers was a pattern so disturbing that when Clark Thomas Hayes first noticed it in 1847, he stopped writing mid-sentence, his pen trembling above the page. 11 children, all documented as enslaved, all described with the same peculiar notation, light complexion, European features, questionable origin. All had come from Thornhill Plantation. Hayes had been recording slave births and transfers for nearly 2 decades. He'd seen every variation the brutal arithmetic of slavery could produce, the children of mixed unions, the gradations of skin tone that determined a person's value at auction, the careful documentation that reduced human beings to livestock. But this was different. These children weren't listed as mulatto or quadroon, the term slaveholders used to categorize those of mixed African and European ancestry. The descriptions were more specific, more troubling. Hair straight, brown, eyes blue-gray, skin white, freckled, features entirely Caucasian in appearance, and every single entry traced back to the same place. A cotton plantation 15 miles south of Savannah, owned by the Marlowe family for 3 generations. Hayes closed the ledger and didn't speak of it to anyone. Some things he'd learned were safer left unexamined in Georgia in 1847. But he couldn't stop thinking about those children. Couldn't stop wondering what was happening behind the gates of Thornhill Plantation that would produce such a consistent, impossible pattern. He wasn't the only one who'd noticed. Thomas Hayes had never intended to become a keeper of secrets. He'd taken the courthouse clerk position in 1829, fresh from a failed attempt at running a general store in Augusta. The work was tedious but steady, recording births, deaths, property transfers, tax assessments. In a county where human beings were bought and sold like cattle, most of the paperwork involved slavery in some form. Over the years, Hayes had developed a particular system for organizing records. He cross-referenced birth registries with property transfers, tracked family lineages, noted patterns in estate management. It was partly professional pride, partly a way to make sense of the overwhelming volume of documentation that passed through his hands. He'd created his own filing system indexed by a plantation name that allowed him to trace the movement of enslaved people across Chatham County with unusual precision. It was this system that revealed the pattern. On a humid afternoon, in July 1847, while reorganizing files damaged by a roof leak, Hayes pulled records for Thornhill Plantation to verify some tax documentation. As he laid out the birth registries chronologically, something caught his attention. The first entry was from 1831. Female child born to Hannah, enslaved, light-skinned, unusual features. Sold at 6 months old to a plantation in McIntosh County, then 1833. Male child born to Patience, enslaved, pale complexion, straight hair, blue eyes. Sold at 8 months to an estate in Glenn County, 1835. Female child born to Rebecca, enslaved, white-skinned European features, sold at 1 year to a planter in Liberty County. The entries continued, spaced roughly 18 to 24 months apart, each describing children who seemed impossible given their mother's documented descriptions. And every child was sold within the first year of life, always to distant plantations, always with the notation from Thornhill Estate. Hayes spread 15 years of birth records across his desk, his hands shaking slightly as the pattern became undeniable. This wasn't the random occurrence of mixed-race children which happened on many plantations. This was systematic, regular, deliberate. He thought about taking the records to his supervisor, then reconsidered. Judge Warren Pembroke owned 3 plantations himself and was known to socialize with Edmund Marlowe. Hayes thought about the sheriff, then remembered that Sheriff Dixon had purchased 2 young slaves from Thornhill just last year. Everyone was connected. Everyone had interests to protect. Hayes carefully returned the records to their proper places, but he kept his own private notation, a small ledger he maintained at home, where he documented what he'd seen him on the street. She would have assumed he was the son of a shopkeeper or a farmer, perhaps Irish or Scottish in origin. She certainly wouldn't have guessed he was enslaved. The room went silent. The auctioneer, a man named Brennan, who'd conducted hundreds of these sales, seemed momentarily at a loss for words. He shuffled his papers, cleared his throat, adjusted his spectacles. From Thornhill Plantation, he finally announced, his voice lacking its usual confidence. The mother, Esther, aged approximately 25, strong, healthy, experienced in fieldwork and domestic service. The child name recorded as Thomas, aged 5 years, sound of body, good temperament, both for sale as a lot, or separately if preferred. Starting bid, wait. The interruption came from the back of the room, a planter Rebecca didn't recognize, tall and weathered with the suspicious expression of a man who'd been cheated before. "Where's his father?" The auctioneer shuffled his papers again. "Not listed in the documentation, sir, as is common in such cases." "Common?" The planter's voice rose. "Look at that child, Brennan. Look at his mother. You telling me that's a natural combination?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several planters moved closer to the platform, examining the pair with the clinical detachment they'd use when inspecting livestock. The boy pressed closer to his mother, his green eyes wide with fear. "The documentation is complete and legal, gentlemen," Brennan said, his voice firm now, taking control of the situation. "The child was born enslaved, properly registered with Chatham County. The mother's ownership is undisputed. Both are legal property of Thornhill Plantation, consigned here for sale by Mr. Edmund Marlowe. I have all the papers in order." "But who's the father?" another voice called out. "That boy looks white as chalk. Someone here knows something about Thornhill Plantation." "We don't." The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Rebecca watched her Uncle Edward shift uncomfortably beside the platform. She saw Brennan's jaw tighten, saw his hand grip his gavel a bit too firmly. "The father's identity is not gerene to the sale," Brennan declared. "Under Georgia law, the status of a child follows the condition of the mother. Esther is enslaved. Therefore, her child is enslaved regardless of paternity. That is the law, gentlemen. Now shall we proceed with the bidding?" The planter at the back of the room shook his head in disgust and walked out. Several others followed. Those who remained bid cautiously, as if uncertain what they were purchasing, as if the child's appearance made them somehow complicit in something they didn't want to acknowledge. The pair eventually sold for less than the auctioneer had expected. $400 for both. Purchased by a farmer from Burke County who needed field hands and seemed less troubled by the boy's appearance than others. Or perhaps he saw an opportunity, Rebecca thought darkly. A child who looked like that could be employed. Lee never came to public auction at all. The Marlowe are always careful to separate the children from their mothers after a few years. Send them to different sales, different counties. Makes it harder to track a pattern. Why would they do that? Her uncle's expression darkened. Because someone at Thornhill doesn't want anyone asking questions. Because if all these children appeared together, if people saw them all at once, even in Georgia, someone might be bothered enough to make trouble. Spread them out, sell them young before they can talk, send them far away. The pattern disappears. Each child becomes an isolated case, an affair, maybe something people shrug off and forget. Rebecca thought about the boy, about his terrified green eyes, about how he'd clung to his mother as they were led away. What will happen to him? The same thing that happens to all enslaved children. He'll work. He'll grow up not knowing his father, not knowing the full truth of where he came from. Maybe he'll survive to see freedom someday. Maybe not. But he'll never have a normal life. Rebecca, how could he? Born into slavery looking like that, with a history that no one wants to examine too closely. Uncle Edward finished his whiskey and poured another glass. "I've been in this business 30 years. I've seen every kind of cruelty, every kind of injustice. But what's happening at Thornhill Plantation is something different. It's systematic. It's deliberate. And everyone with power knows about it and does nothing. Been sold through private transactions that left no paper trail? The true number could be 50, could be 100, spanning 3 generations of the Marlowe family going back to the late 1700s. Dr. Fielding kept his research locked in a trunk in his office under his medical supplies where no casual search would find it. He continued his practice, treating patients, building his reputation. But late at night, he would review his documentation. adding new cases as he discovered them, building a record of systematic abuse that spanned decades. And he waited for an opportunity to make it public, to force someone with power to acknowledge what was happening at Thornhill Plantation. That opportunity would not come for years, but Fielding was patient, methodical, determined. He believed that truth, once properly documented, would eventually demand justice. He had no idea how wrong he was. In March of 1848, a woman named Ruth was sent to doctor the Fielding's office by her current owner, a merchant named Tobias Wright, who'd purchased her 6 months earlier at a private sale. She was suffering from persistent fever and respiratory problems that weren't responding to home remedies. Fielding examined her in the small back room he used for treating enslaved patients, separate from the main office where he saw white clients. The physical separation was legally required and socially expected, another reminder of the rigid caste system that governed every aspect of Southern life. Ruth was perhaps 2 or 3 times a week. He kept careful records of everything. When he visited, which woman he spent time with, when pregnancies were confirmed. He treated the whole operation like a business venture, which Fielding realized with disgust it essentially was. "I got pregnant the first time when I was 18, Ruth said, her voice cracking. "I was terrified. I didn't know what would happen to the baby, but they took good care of me during the pregnancy. Better food, lighter work, the midwife checking on me regularly. When I gave birth, it was a boy. He had pale skin, light brown hair. Mr. Marlowe took him away the same day. I never even got to hold him properly. Just saw him for a few minutes before the midwife took him up to the main house. She'd given birth to 3 children during those 6 years. All 3 had pale skin, light hair, features that marked them as different. All 3 were taken away within days of birth. She never knew where they went, never knew if they survived, never got to see them again. The second time I gave birth, it was twins. Ruth said girls. They both had blonde hair, blue eyes, beautiful babies. Mr. Marlowe looked at them like they were prized livestock, talking about how much they'd fetch at auction. I begged him to let me keep at least one. He laughed. Said I didn't understand economics. Said separating them would actually increase their value. Twins being rare, he could sell them to 2 different buyers and tell each one it was unique. More profit that way. Fielding felt sick. The casual cruelty, the pure mercenary calculation, the complete absence of any recognition that these were human beings, not commodities. There were other women who came through while I was there, Ruth continued. Some died in childbirth. There was one girl, couldn't have been more than 16. She hemorrhaged after delivering, and they couldn't stop the bleeding. Mr. Marlowe was angry about losing the investment. Not sad about her death, just angry about the financial loss. Another woman went mad after her 3rd child was taken, started screaming one day and never stopped. They eventually moved her somewhere else. I don't know where. Maybe sold her, maybe just killed her. I don't know. Ruth, Fielding said carefully, would you be willing to testify to this? To what you've told me, if I could find a lawyer or perhaps contact officials in. She laughed a broken sound without humor. Testify. Testify where, doctor, to whom? Slaves can't testify against white men in Georgia. You know that I have no legal standing, no rights, no voice that any court would recognize. But if I wrote down what you said, if I documented your account, it wouldn't matter. Ruth's voice was flat, empty of hope. He owns me. Legally, I'm his property to do with as he wishes. Every lawyer, every judge, every lawman in Georgia would say the same thing. There's no law being broken, doctor. That's the horror of it. It's all completely legal. He can do whatever he wants to his property. People were paid to look the other way. Fielding treated Ruth's respiratory infection and gave her medicine for the fever. He also gave her owner Tobias Wright instructions that would require keeping Ruth in Savannah for at least a few weeks while she recovered. But 3 days later, when Fielding sent a follow-up inquiry to Wright's household, he was informed that Ruth had been sold. Wright had received an offer he couldn't refuse, $200 more than he'd paid for her just months earlier, from a trader who specialized in moving enslaved people to the Deep South. The trader had mentioned that the buyer was operating on behalf of a client in Alabama who needed house servants. Ruth was already on her way west beyond Fielding's reach, beyond any possibility of testifying or providing evidence. Fielding didn't need to investigate to know who was behind the sale. Edmund Marlowe had learned that Ruth was in Savannah, had discovered that she'd been to see a physician, and had acted swiftly to eliminate the potential threat. But Fielding had taken one precaution during Ruth's visit. While examining her, he'd asked her to repeat her entire story while he took extensive notes, writing down everything she said in careful detail. He dated and signed the document, then locked it in his trunk with the rest of his Thornhill research. It wasn't legal testimony. It wouldn't hold up in court, but it was documentation, evidence, a record that someone had cared enough to preserve her story. If the cyst